No, it's not the Ramones, the late great punk band. These lads are the Chinese punk band SMZB with their tongue-in-cheek song, The Chinese Are Coming. And where shall we go? To China. Welcome to Science Friction.
There's a thriving black market in all sorts of things. There was a story in The Economist several years ago now that actually, the lead of the story, the first paragraph, it read like something out of a Hollywood mafia movie. There was a police raid on one of these companies, and they were actually throwing bags of cash out the fire escape, out the back. This sounds like something out of, The Godfather, or who knows what, or Tony Soprano doing this. And this is actually about scientific publishing.
This is Dr. Ivan Aransky. He trained as a doctor, but went on to become a leading investigative medical journalist.
As a reporter, I like stories that are hiding in plain sight.
But as you'll hear, there's a lot that isn't hiding in plain sight in China. Hi, I'm Natasha Mitchell with you. For China in Focus this week on ABC RN, we are digging into scientific fraud.
Certainly, we dig further. We file public records requests. We try and get documents. We try and get people to leak things to us. We do all of that work. But the nugget of the story often begins with something that's hiding in plain sight, and retractions were a really completely undercovered area.
Ivan is co-founder of an influential blog called Retraction Watch.
We thought, here's a really good, treasure trove. We can really mine this vein.
So Retraction Watch serves as a watchdog, unearthing and exposing scientific misconduct and fraud. And often a problem with a scientific study really only comes to light after the fact, after it's been published and absorbed by the world scientific community. When a scientific journal retracts or pulls a paper from publication, something is wrong, sometimes very wrong.
It's a statement by the journal, by the authors, sometimes by the university, etc., that this result, this finding, this conclusion is not reliable anymore. Do not rely on this, whether it's in your work, whether it's in your thinking, whether it's in your next experiment that you're trying to do.
Stop right now. Yes.
Right. There is literally a big red watermark on the PDF of this paper.
And that's what happened last year when one journal retracted 107 papers, all at once and all authored by Chinese scientists. The journal is called Tumour Biology, and what happened is probably only the tip of an iceberg.
The fact that they were all from one journal was obviously quite eye-opening. That journal rocketed to the top of the charts in terms of how many retractions it had. It also lost a lot of credibility, no surprise there, and actually ended up being dumped by its publisher.
You do see this kind of very large-scale fraud going on in China, and there's a bunch of different factors, a bunch of different methods that lead to that. I am David Saranowski. I'm the Asia-Pacific correspondent for Nature based in Shanghai.
But a heads up, David's not representing the journal Nature here in this program. His comments are his own.
They have these fake article mills that kind of pump out papers on order, so people can ask them to produce a paper of a certain kind, and they will produce it. They'll produce the figures, the data, and everything, and give it to you. And they also have fake peer review.
More than 600 papers have now been retracted since 2012 for fake peer review, arguably many more than that.
And what is fake peer review? Because for people who aren't familiar with the peer review process and its absolute importance in the scientific process, what's happening? What have you been detecting?
What's supposed to happen with peer review is that if I have made a finding and I'm very excited and I write a paper about it, I submit it to a journal, and then that journal editor, deciding whether he or she wants to even pursue the manuscript, if he or she does, then that person will send it out to usually 3, sometimes 4 peer reviewers. So these are peers. These are other scientists who have some expertise in my area, probably my competitors. They can review the manuscript. They can say, actually, it doesn't make sense, or, well, it makes sense, but here this figure is not quite right, or you should have done this experiment, various sort of reviews.
Theoretically, they're a robust scrutineer.
Theoretically, they are. And in terms of even when something does go through the sort of proper peer review, quite frankly, we see a lot of cases where things are not caught that really should be. I mean, when a paper's published, and the minute it's published, someone is posting online saying, that figure looks funny or this is wrong, you do have to wonder, where were the peer reviewers? What were they doing? It's a human endeavor. It's only one filter. And so I think we're being naive, and I think that we are trusting the process too much if we just sort of trust that everything that's been peer reviewed must have what we would call sort of a good housekeeping seal of approval. It's just not the case. But with fake peer review, it's actually a whole other level of malfeasance.
Yes, you've heard of fake news. Yes, you've seen it in your Facebook feed. But what the hell is fake peer review? Well, it's
where either an individual scientist or a company representing that scientist will submit a paper, and when they submit the paper to the journal, they will give some peer reviews, some names of peer reviews and the email addresses, and say, please contact this person because they will help you evaluate my paper. And when they give these names of peer reviewers, the journal then goes to them and asks them, is this paper okay? But the email addresses they have basically take them back to the company or to the individual who is trying to publish the paper. And of course, then they just give the paper rave reviews.
That's extraordinary, and that was, to a great extent, the reason for the mass retraction by the journal Tumour Biology last year.
That's right. That's where they were caught on most of that.
I requested an interview with the editor-in-chief of the journal Tumour Biology, which has recently changed publishers. He didn't reply to my request. But what of the hundreds of scientists who allegedly engaged fake peer reviewers to get into that relatively lo-fi cancer research journal?
Then people say, well, wow, that's quite devious. Why didn't they just apply all of that work and that effort and that ingenuity to science? And that's an excellent question. Sometimes we've had the chance to talk to some of these people who've committed the fake peer reviews.
Have you?
But most of the time they don't. The very first case we reported on, it was someone from South Korea. He ended up having to retract 28 papers for this. And he actually, he did a very interesting thing, which I suppose nowadays is just, what certain politicians do, but he blamed it on the people that he had hoodwinked. He actually said, well, if those editors had been paying attention, then they would have seen the problem. Yes, I've broken into the bank, but, if you would just hire a better security guard, I wouldn't have been able to do that.
I think this particular case actually indicates the problem of not only scientists, but also some sort of kind of companies engaged in those kind of misconduct. Okay, my name is Chong Cao. I'm a professor in innovation studies at the University of Nottingham, Ningbo, China, which is a joint venture between the University of Nottingham in the UK and the Chinese entity. This market is really large. In China, for scientists to be promoted, they have to have a certain number of papers, right? So the promotion also is linked to their salary, etc., right? And for Chinese graduate students to graduate, they also need to publish papers. Initially, they only asked to publish papers in Chinese journals. And now, at leading universities, they're also required to have papers published in international journals, right? So you really have those kind of demand from not only scientists, but also from doctoral students, master students. So the market is there.
And it's a very black market indeed.
What happened over the years was that this whole process was sort of industrialized. So this really is a sort of shadowy world. And I don't use this term lightly. There's organized crime in certain countries has realized that there's a lot of money to be made here. But these companies were set up. A lot of authors were using these sort of third-party editing service companies that maybe on the door or on their website it said, we'll translate and we'll do all the packaging for you. It's actually considered okay for someone else to do those kinds of tasks for you. The problem was what was happening in the back room. And in the back room, that paper might have been sold to someone else. We've seen cases where those companies were actually trying to publish the same paper more than once, and then they all got retracted at once. But often they were creating these sort of fake peer review rings where they would set up, dummy accounts. They would set up friends of these dummy accounts and have the papers peer-reviewed for you. And you may or may not have known about this, but Chinese government, when they investigated, they found that most of the researchers who had to retract these 107 papers, I think the number was 486 or something like that, close to 500 of them, actually knew what was going on and had committed misconduct.
But it goes well beyond this. I've seen a lot of faked CVs in China. People put other people's publications on their resumes to get jobs or promotions or whatever. So there's a very large-scale problem and very multifaceted problem with fakery in China.
So they even provide fake data?
Yes.
Wow, that's wild, isn't it?
Yes, that's true, yeah.
I mean, what does this kind of black market mean for Chinese science and indeed global science, do you think?
It's a threat. It's a kind of challenging for the international scientific community to figure out whether a particular piece of research coming out of China is genuine or fake.
Whether it's genuine or fake.
So this is very, very difficult. Yeah, so that's kind of reputational damage to Chinese science as a whole is huge. That also means why, the Chinese government really wants to step in to do something. The image issue, so...
Well, it's kind of more than an image issue, isn't it? It's
Yeah. But I think from the leadership perspective, probably the image issue is more important than anything else, so...
It's a very risky situation for Chinese science, isn't it? Because it can mean that people just turn away and don't trust science coming out of China. And given the scale of investment in Chinese science, it really does undermine the whole enterprise.
I completely agree with you. That also endanger international collaboration between Chinese scientists and their peers outside China. So if those sort of things continue to be happening, it's going to be very, very difficult for China and for Chinese scientists to go abroad. So.
Now, it's important to say here, as we look at the incidence of scientific fraud in China and why Chinese scientists are responsible for amongst the highest number of papers retracted by scientific journals, that not all retractions are evidence of misdemeanours. Dr. Ivan Aransky of Retraction Watch has seen it all.
About 20% of the time, it's some kind of honest error. Maybe you sort of calculated something wrong. You maybe even used the wrong stem cell line or just any cell line. These are models that people use in the lab of cells that grow over years and over decades. Maybe you were using the wrong one. Maybe you used the wrong chemical in the lab. You picked a bottle that was labeled incorrectly, and all of a sudden you realize you made a mistake. Those things happen. Things happen on Excel spreadsheets, and people are looking at various calculations that ended up being wrong.
But more often than not, when a scientific journal retracts a paper, you can probably bet that something dodgy has happened.
Well, about 2/3 of retractions, and this has been fairly consistent over time, are due to some version of misconduct. And this sort of definition of misconduct scientifically is either falsification, which means you sort of made things look better than they were, fabrication, which means you made it up, or plagiarism. And plagiarism is probably the most straightforward there because you can just compare two bits of text or what have you.
And even selling of authorship, there will be a paper where a company will sell authorship and say, which, if you want to be the first author or the corresponding author, you have to pay this much. And if you're going to be somewhere in the middle, you can pay this much. So it's quite elaborate too.
Have you managed to speak to scientists who have ultimately been convicted of scientific misconduct or indeed have engaged fake peer reviews?
Actually, if you don't mind, this is something we're working on right now, so I can't really talk about it. But as you can guess, people don't generally want to talk about this. It's something that they're ashamed of or they're potentially legally liable for. So they're not generally willing to discuss it. And if you email them, if you say, I want to talk about your fraudulent paper, you're not likely to get a response.
Good luck with that.
Oh, look at this. The ligaments of the knee.
China has positioned itself very rapidly as a global economic power. We all know that. But the country's leadership also wants it to be a scientific superpower because, of course, one feeds the other.
When the Cultural Revolution ended in 1976, a couple of years later, China started this reform and open door kind of policy in late 1970s. So the science and technology system was among the first to be reformed. The reform actually started in 1985.
Professor Tsung Sao's books include China's Scientific Elite and China's Emerging Technological Edge.
So in the meanwhile, the government and the society as a whole has invested tremendous resources into research and development. So gross expenditure on research and development basically has been growing at fast rates than the GDP, sometimes twice the GDP growth rate.
There's been a desire to win China a Nobel Prize in science, hasn't there? How strongly has that been a clearly stated motivation?
That has been actually an important issue on the agenda of the political and scientific leadership since 1995 and the last 20 plus years, is that try to win China a Nobel Prize in science. But the thing is that if you really want to achieve something in science, there needs to be a period of accumulation. But for China, you have only like 40 years after the Cultural Revolution. You have only 40 years for you to, for scientists to be able to concentrate their efforts for doing science. But 40 years is still probably too short.
President Xi Jinping has said explicitly that he wants China to become a global power in science and technology. What have you observed happening in an effort to position China as a global science power?
A huge investment in facilities, from telescopes, the biggest telescopes in the world now are being built in China, to quantum computing, to gene editing and things like that. They do a lot of monkey experimentation, which is expensive stuff. They have huge colonies of monkeys, the whole range of science. And I think they want to be comprehensive in terms of basic to applied. And they also want to be at the cutting edge of these fields. And they're typically strong in a lot of the very practical fields of chemistry and solid state physics. So these things that underlie a lot of the computer technologies and information technologies in the future. Artificial intelligence is something that they're very keen on right now. So just huge investments and a recognition that you need to have the talent to push these initiatives that they have. And right now that's their biggest headache, but that's a headache for every country around the world, is where do you get the people, the brains to make these things work? And it's a huge competitive global marketplace right now for the best brains in science. And I think that's what's pushing the Chinese government. They realize that all of this fraud, is not only bad for these institutions, but it's bad for China and China's global competitiveness in things that the government thinks are very important, which is, geopolitics and its technology race and all of these things that China knows are crucial for its future. The Chinese government has always known that it doesn't want its scientists to be cheating, but it hasn't really effectively enforced those rules in the past.
But that looks set to change after the Chinese leadership's announcement in May this year of a whole suite of reforms designed to crack down on scientific misconduct.
A country like China, given its government and its structure, when they decide to do something, they can just go and do it. And they can, I don't know that it's even hyperbole to say they can move mountains, but they can certainly move metaphorical mountains when it comes to this sort of thing. So one of the things you saw in China, which was deeply problematic, is, in terms of incentives, is that researchers were actually paid these very large cash bonuses for publishing in the what are known as high impact factor journals. If you start thinking about that, if you know that you will get what is essentially a half salary or even whole salary bonus for publishing one paper, your mind is going to change. I would like to think that mine wouldn't, but that's really hard. I mean, we're human beings. We're sort of victims of our own biases and incentives and what have you.
I think when those kind of reward policy was put forward by different institutions, I saw there's some sort of value over there. I mean, once For one thing, you really encourage scientists to publish in leading journals, right? Basically, the paper published in leading journal basically means you have achieved something very significant. Otherwise, it would be impossible for you to publish those kind of papers, right? So that's one thing. It's really encourage scientists to be innovative, to be creative, to be moving to the frontier of international science. That's the first thing. I think the second thing is that, by and large, Chinese scientists, though they work very, very hard, paid very, very badly. I mean, the scientists actually, at the time, they had to supplement their low salary by getting research grants, and by publishing paper outside. Of course, there is some sort of unintended consequence of those kind of policy in which scientists try to fabricate the data, try to falsify the data, and try maybe to plagiarize other people's idea, etc.
The other problem in China that was related and probably it was responsible, at least indirectly, for the tumor biology case, where there were more than 100 retractions at once, is that unlike in pretty much any other country, medical school faculty, in other words, clinical medical school faculty, who are really in every other country just expected to see patients or teach residents and medical students. And often, I have a position like this where it's a voluntary position at New York University's medical school. I'm not expected to publish papers, and in most other countries, you're not expected to publish papers. In China, however, you have to publish 2 papers in order to get promoted, even if you are a clinical faculty member in a medical school. How we would expect that to lead to anything other than chaos and people scrambling to publish and often doing something fraudulent, that's sort of beyond me. I sort of see that as the completely foreseeable, predictable consequence. And so, you have these people who don't know anything about research, who have to publish a paper. They go to one of these companies, and then all of a sudden you have plagiarism, or you have fake peer review, or some other problem, predatory journals. And so the incentives are all misaligned.
Scientific fraud occurs everywhere in every country. It's not unique to China, but do you think China has a unique problem when it comes to scientific fraud?
I don't think China's situation is different from what you can observe outside China. Those sort of things, as you just mentioned, occurs everywhere. But the problem in China right now is the linkage between the number of publications or the number of patent applications with the performance evaluation, promotion, grant application, etc. In the Western kind of context, you would most likely not see those kind of linkage.
I'm always careful to sort of single out a particular country.
There is a risk of singling out China, and there's a potential racism to that as well. I know Chinese scientists have been very frustrated by the sorts of prejudice they encounter in the wider scientific community, the global scientific community.
Absolutely, and I think we hear that also from scientists in India who are faced with a lot of the same problems. It's one of the arguments for what's known as blinding peer review, so no one knows where the paper's from. I think there's something to that, whether it's China, whether it's India, frankly, whether it's a lot of other countries. Africa is starting to really have much more of a commitment to science and to spending money on science, and that's a good thing for science. The question is whether those scientists are sort of trusted by the rest of the community yet. They should be, just as much as a lot of, we see plenty of fraud in the West, but a lot of them are sort of noting that they're facing the same problems that China and India and other countries are facing in various countries in Africa, where there's this racism or bias, whatever you want to call it, that is preventing them from doing as well.
Nevertheless, the Chinese government knows it has a problem. Professor Sung Sao.
I think the most important reasons is that when those kind of cases occurred in international journals, they usually get kind of media coverage very widely. It really damages the image of Chinese science as a whole, and maybe the image of China as a whole. So I think that's the main reason why the government wants to step in to crack down those kind of behavior. I think the government realized the seriousness of the issue.
If you commit misconduct, you commit fraud in terms of research that is intended for the clinic, in other words, that is a new drug or a new device, something like that, if it's informing that, you actually could face the death penalty. Now, again, that's quite extreme. In many parts of the world, you don't face the death penalty for going out and killing someone. Now, is that just sending a message? Is it posturing? Is it something real? We don't know, and we haven't seen any cases prosecuted yet. But it's very clear that China's government sees this as a problem internationally and understands that the world is always going to be looking at what they're doing.
So the Chinese government, right up to the top leadership of the Chinese Communist Party, have made a recent announcement about scientific misconduct. What is it and how significant is it?
It's very significant. It came from the State Council, which is like China's cabinet, and the Communist China Party. It was a joint issued opinion. And coming from those two bodies, the most powerful in China, it carries a lot of weight.
China can, really, the party can rule by fiat. They do, and it's a dictatorship. They can decide this is going to be the rule, and they can make some cases, sort of exemplars of people, and all of a sudden everyone toes the line. It remains to be seen what will actually happen.
So one of the things that they've suggested is that the Ministry of Science and Technology will be responsible for managing investigations into scientific misconduct. How substantial a change is that?
I think, if you look at it on paper, it doesn't seem that interesting, it doesn't seem surprising.
Well, often institutions do the investigating, don't they? And they're hardly neutral players.
Well, yeah, institutions in China, like institutions around the world, and this is something we do see in countries around the world, they don't want to investigate their own. The fact that China has given it specifically to the Ministry of Science and Technology and is making them responsible for this means that if something happens, someone there is going to be taking the fall. This is something that you see across the government in China right now with Xi Jinping. He has an anti-corruption campaign, and it's kind of new in China to be giving people this kind of responsibility and enforcing them to follow up on it, with the potential that they would lose their jobs or go to jail if it's corruption. Researchers themselves can be put on a blacklist, either a lifelong blacklist where they won't be able to get grants anymore. They can lose positions, they can lose their honorary positions of some sort. If they're an academician, they can lose all this. And basically that's their life, that's their career. So basically they could lose their career.
It'd be all over.
As a scientist, yes.
How punitive could the Chinese government get with their punishments of scientific misconduct?
I think they are going to get punitive in a sense. They're getting very systematic about how they're going to punish these people and how they're going to make it stick.
There's other areas of science or other countries.
Yes, the Chinese policy shift risks scaring the wits completely out of Chinese scientists, doesn't it? And that in itself is not conducive to a transparent, open-spirited culture of science necessarily.
No, you obviously, you need carrots and you need sticks. And so it's good to have sticks. And I think that certainly the Chinese government has created a lot of sticks. The question is, will they and others create the carrots that will actually encourage good behavior? If we want to see a scientific culture and if we want to see a sort of robust, what we refer to as, reproducibility culture, in other words, let's make sure things actually work and we don't just cut corners, then we need to actually encourage good behavior, whether it's data sharing, whether it's encouraging people to check one another's work, whether it's what we refer to as post-publication peer review, the idea that we should reward people who come forward about problems in other people's work, not in a punitive way, but actually looking at it and saying, hey, that's a problem, we should do something about it, and giving people the chance to correct the record. We are not seeing enough of that now, but at least people are starting to think about it. But if you just scare the bejesus out of everyone and say, don't do this, basic psychology will tell you that isn't going to solve your problem. It may drive some people out of science that shouldn't be there. It may drive some people out of science, probably more so, that really want to be there and want to do well, but just they kind of give up at some point.
When you talk to scientists who are doing their job right, I don't think they generally fear this. They follow their data and they feel pretty confident about it. And when they feel confident about it, they'll publish it.
We haven't seen a real case by using this kind of policy, but so we don't know what's going to happen. But the thing is, if for ordinary kind of scientists, it's probably not a big issue. right? So, but if something happened to a very famous scientist, so how government is going to deal with that case is going to be kind of test to be seen. So whether it's really serious about the issue.
And thank you to co-founder of Retraction Watch, medical journalist Dr. Ivan Aransky, and to Professor Tsung Sao and science journalist David Siranowski. You can check out all the other shows bringing you China in Focus specials across ABC RN. abc.net.au/RN is the place to head. Great, really thought-provoking stuff to wrap your ears around. I highly recommend it. I'm Natasha Mitchell. Thank you to Joe Kahn and Kerry Dell. Tweet me anytime at Natasha Mitchell. Love to hear from you.